here. So thank you for being here and joining us for our first event of the Social Impact Series. This event is titled Rebuilders, Leadership for Impact. The Social Impact Series grew out of a collaborative event that took place during Global Entrepreneurship Week in 2020, where we hosted an insightful panel discussion around social impact and really about looking at the sustainability of social impact. And so after that event, we saw a huge appetite for continued discussion around this area, as well as knowledge sharing around the topics of social innovation, social entrepreneurship, and leadership. So we're really excited to continue that collaboration going forward. And we've had some amazing partners that have continued to meet on a regular basis. Us at the Carlson Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship at Sacramento State, Social Venture Partners of Sacramento, and William Jessup University are all the collaborative partners in this event in the continued series. And so for those of you that don't know me, my name is Cameron Law. I'm the Executive Director of the Carlson Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship. I'm joined by two amazing team members. We have Arlene Miranda and then Jesse Becker-Alexander. So really excited to have them here today. The Carlson Center serves as a regional hub and platform for providing approachable and accessible entrepreneurial education, community, and support to enable startup founders of all backgrounds to explore and launch their businesses. And we have this clear mission to make innovation and entrepreneurship pervasive throughout the greater Sacramento region, and really working to realize this vision of being a premier hub of innovation and entrepreneurship. And how we've gone about operationalizing that is three main categories of programming, which are discover, build, and launch. And so this event and collaboration is part of our discover sets of programs, all about creating those on-ramps, that inspiration, as well as that knowledge sharing to get people excited and moving forward in their entrepreneurial endeavors. And so we're really excited for this partnership and this conversation here today. I'm going to pass it off to Sienna Crawford, who's the Executive Director of Social Venture Partners of Sacramento, and she'll be sharing a little bit about SVP.
Thank you so much, Cameron, and good evening, everybody. I'm excited to be here with all of you this evening for this event. As Cameron said, my name is Sienna Crawford, and I'm the Executive Director for SVP Sacramento, otherwise known or also known as Social Venture Partners of Sacramento, which is part of a global network founded by Paul Shoemaker in 1997. It now comprises of thousands of social innovators, entrepreneurs, philanthropists, business and community leaders that support local change agents in over 40 cities and 8 countries globally. SVP Sacramento is just one of 40 affiliates, and we apply time, talent, and treasure to support local nonprofits working on our investment thesis that every student in the greater Sacramento region is on a clear path of economic security. We focus on improving the key outcome areas of social emotional learning, STEM or STEAM, as we like to include the arts, digital fluency, and workforce readiness to realize this impact. We accomplish this by leveraging capacity building, grant making, and skilled volunteerism. Our signature events are Fast Pitch and Think Tankathon. For those of you that don't know much about those events, or I know many of you have been to one or either or both, Fast Pitch is a social innovation program and a pitch event which empowers 20 local nonprofits in their ability to tell their story. And Think Tankathons are design thinking workshops where we bring together our skilled partnership base with community leaders and engaged philanthropists to solve the most pressing challenges that nonprofits face today. We leverage the expertise of these leaders to find a set of solutions to their challenge, their specific challenge, and we follow through with one-on-one follow-up to support each organization with implementation. And at this point, I'd like to pass the mic to Entrepreneur in Residence at the Carlson Center, Jesse Becker-Alexander.
Thanks, Sienna. Hi, everyone. I'm Jessie. I work with Cameron at the Carlson Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship. I'm an entrepreneur in residence, which means I get to do fun things like this. So I'm going to be your MC for the evening, but you're mostly going to hear from Paul and John today. So I'm going to hop right into it and introduce Paul to you all. Sienna did a great job and already shared quite a bit about SVP. Paul, of course, is the founding president of Social Venture Partners. And in that role, he's worked with countless leaders who are all focused on some sort of social change. And he's done that over the course of the last 17 years. For his work in this role, he is recognized as a global thought leader for activating social change. For instance, in 2011 and 2012, he was named the top 50 most influential people in the nonprofit sector, which is really cool to be named that 2 years in a row. As well, in 2013, he was named Philanthropist of the Year by Future in Review. So as a speaker, we're really glad to have him here today as a speaker because he has enthralled audiences at TEDx as well as the UN. And he's written for the Stanford Social Innovation Review and the Huffington Post. Once I let him get talking, I promise not to let this introduction drag on too long, but once I let him get talking, you'll hear a little bit about the importance of cross-sector fluency. And both Paul and John are great examples of leaders who embody that cross-sector fluency. Paul in particular has worked for over decades in both the private sector and the nonprofit sector. And he's been able to work closely with the public sector during that time as well. From that vantage point, he's been able to observe hundreds of leaders across many industries, many of whom he's profiled in his new book, which I have right here. And we encourage you all to take a look. Taking Charge of Change, How Rebuilders Solve Hard Problems. We look forward to having him share his perspective on the core traits and skill sets that such leaders possess, and ultimately how the rebuilders of tomorrow can help make our world a better place. So one of those rebuilders, that's Paul, everyone. Moving on to John. One of our rebuilders is a local leader in the Sacramento area who possesses many of the qualities that Paul has identified in his new book. He's the co-chief executive and co-founder of Origin Materials. And I have to tell you, I'm not exactly sure what Origin Materials does, but I'm going to give it a shot and John can correct me later. So Origin Materials has developed a unique disruptive technology that turns sustainable wood residues into a wide variety of materials, including plastics. What's really great about that is, hey, we want to save the earth, and those materials are carbon negative, cost competitive with current options, and they are recyclable. John himself has had a ton of success with this company. He recently led the company through a merger with a SPAC. This new SPAC thing is really interesting. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that. And in doing so, raised over $1 billion in capital for the company collectively. His list of accomplishments is truly long. He's an inventor on over 24 issued and pending patents. He was named to the Forbes 30 Under 30 list. And he was also named to Goldman Sachs 100 Most Intriguing Entrepreneurs. Wow, that's a lot. Okay, cool. Locally, he has been an active supporter of SVP as a fast pitch coach, and he's a UC Davis alum and received the UC Davis Young Alumnus Award. We are really excited to welcome John here today as a local leader for tomorrow. And that concludes my very long introductions. I hope that did both of you justice. What to expect now from the event. Paul is going to spend a few minutes telling us a little bit about what he learned during the process of all of his experience and in the process of writing his book. And then Paul and John are going to have a great interview conversation. And we reserved the last 20 minutes or so for the audience to pipe in and do Q&A with both of them. So without further ado, I'll be quiet, and Paul, please take it away.
Oh man, thank you, Jesse. Thank you, Sienna. Thank you, Cameron. It's great to be with all of you guys in Sacramento. So start with a visual with me for just a minute of a mountain. So for the second half of the 20th century, America was slowly, unevenly, but surely climbing this mountain. We were making progress. For the last 20 years, we've been going the other direction. We've been descending that mountain. And 2020 was like falling off the steep hillside, off of the cliff on the pathway down that mountain. That mountain and the apex is economic, social, and health equity in America. Climbing back up that mountain, overcoming the divides, to me is the leadership challenge of the decade ahead. And I believe there are 5 leadership traits that are going to respond to those inequities and are going to provide a path forward back up that mountain. And that's what I'll share with you tonight. So I had a sort of a wake-up call in 2018. I was working on a project that was related to poverty in America. And I've worked in, as Jesse said, in the social impact space for over 20 years. All kinds of causes, all kinds of challenges, racial equity, housing, health disparities, et cetera. But I'd been looking at it like one snapshot at a time, sort of like those tiny frames in a photo mosaic where if you see one, you can't see the whole thing. You have to step back to see the whole image. I had to step back to see the whole image. So when I did, to me, it wasn't just the scale and the scope of the inequities. It was the pace and the downward path of inequities over the last generation in America. So consider economically, we know there's been an accelerating wealth disparity. Today, the top 1% of America have as much wealth as the bottom 90%. From an educational standpoint, we were making progress on the education achievement gap between about 1970 and 2005. The last 15 years, we've started to trail off. Health. We can talk about access to quantity of health, but the access to the quality of healthcare, that gap is also widening. So I knew each one of these, but I didn't know all of these. And when you put all those together, that's what made me sort of come to this picture of descending down the mountain. So with that whole picture in mind and sort of a wider lens in 2018, I started in 2019. I said, what kind of leaders and traits are going to help us climb back up that mountain? What kind of leaders do these times call for? So it was a prospective sort of forward-looking thoughts. So what I did was I sort of went back to all my time in the sector and all this work. I've been in the private, nonprofit, public sector. I've worked on big organizations, small ones, different causes all over the map. I was drawing Venn diagrams. I was doing spreadsheets. I was writing on whiteboards. And I'm going to share just a couple slides with you guys here for one time tonight that will give you sort of a grounding framework for where I'm coming from on this. So here's what I was looking for. I was looking for the intersection of the best leaders I'd worked with, along with evidence of true social impact. And then that third circle is to meet the challenges of the decade ahead. And that's sort of what grew out of that conversation I had with myself in 2018. So the intersection of those three, for me, after all that research and all that time, it boiled down to, again, what I called 5 vital traits. What I'm going to do here for a minute is just give you a second to look at this. I'm going to give you a 1-sentence definition of each, so you've at least got it grounded in your head. And then we can come back and we can talk about these later on if we need to. But here's a definition: generosity mindset. These are leaders that have a strategic focus on the ultimate goal. They get past diversions. They get the best from everyone. They know how to make the whole greater than the sum of its parts. 24/7 authenticity. These are leaders with a relentless, persistent commitment to honesty, integrity, and to personal accountability. Data conviction. These are leaders that have a core belief that data is indispensable. They treat it strategically, not tactically. They also know how to use the data wisely. Capacity for complexity. Thinking in a non-linear, less sequential way to take in, make sense of, and act on new information constantly. We know that's the world we live in. And last, cross-sector fluency, which Jesse mentioned about John. These are people that have an ease and a natural movement across all 3 sectors, private, nonprofit, public, in a very fluid, non-transactional way. Over the course of this my talk and tonight, it'd be fun to have people pop in the chat. When you think about the decade ahead, what do you think are the 1 or 2 most important attributes and traits that we need leaders to possess? I always learn something from seeing what other folks think about that. So what I'm going to do tonight, in addition to have a conversation with John, is I want to tell you about one of those people, just to give you a snapshot of what these other 38 leaders are like in the book. And that is Roseanne Haggerty. I'm going to talk to you about her trait of generosity mindset. Try to get her picture in your mind so you can sort of remember her when I go back and I'm talking about her. The other last thing I want to sort of frame for you is this notion of rebuilders. So 3 circles, 5 traits, looking at the challenges of the decade ahead. I need a metaphor that was about repair, rebuilding, moving forward, thinking ahead. Upper left corner, that's Snell Crawford Park in Fort Dodge, Iowa, where I grew up. That is a simple arch bridge that runs through that park. That's my dad and my brother walking down to that creek bed just a few years ago. I would go down there in the summers and I'd sit underneath that bridge for hours and just listen to the cars go over. I was fascinated by bridges. I never became an engineer, but I still thought bridges were just sort of amazing structures, even a simple one there. So every bridge from the Golden Gate Bridge to Snell Crawford Park has 3 parts to it. And the basic foundation, the basic layer is a foundation. So bridges in America are only as strong as their underlying foundation. The state of bridges for me is very evocative of the state of our civil society in America. 40% of our bridges need repair. 8% of them need urgent rebuilding. We have a fundamentally different America than we did 20, even 10 years ago. We need rebuilders for our bridges, for our communities, for our companies across the US. We need people like John. So that's why I call these leaders rebuilders. All right, so now it's 2019. I sort of had my wake up call in 2018, developed a point of view about these traits in 2019. And then 2020 happens. There are decades when nothing happens and weeks when decades happen. That's a quote that's over 100 years old. It is very resonant today. There was more than 1 week or a decade happened in 2020. We all know it, we lived it. And that mountain I was talking about earlier, 2020 was that steep fall down a hillside off of that cliff. Consider a couple of things. The disparities in death rates of Black and brown people were 2 to 3 times the general population. Women's careers were delayed or stalled, sometimes some folks say by as much as a decade. And that education gap I was talking about, we know it grew even more. We just don't know how much more it grew. And just a reminder, to a lot of people, 2020 was this point of inequity in America. It was, but this has been going on for a generation. That's the really important part to remember about this story. And the other thing about 2020 is what you realize, economic, health, and social inequities, they're just one part of our challenge as a country in the decade ahead. We have a divided, siloed America like we haven't had in a long time. We have technology and hyper media that love to sort of accentuate those silos and deepen those divisions. We have the 3 sectors, private, nonprofit, public, blurring together like never before. That's an opportunity. It's also a complexity. And we have a breadth of depth of challenges, climate, geopolitical, automation, that just are like we've never had in a long time before. So the decade we face ahead, it is the most complex I believe we faced in 60, probably 80 years. So our world today is not just inequity, it is complexity. And that 3rd circle at the bottom, challenges of the decade ahead, all that's done is get bigger and messier as the last 18 months have gone on. And it also has made climbing back up that mountain of economic, social, and health equity, it's made the climb steeper and it's made the peak further away for us. But that's why we need leaders for the decade ahead. I was a high school basketball referee for several years. One time I refereed a game in the first quarter. It was really gnarly, ugly, physical. It was just one of those squirrely games. And at the first time out, the veteran referee I was working with, I knew he could see the look on my face. He walked over, he looked at me and he said, "Shoemaker, you need to referee the game you have, not the game you wish you had." So we all have to lead in the America that we have, not the one we wish we had. But where we are today does not have to mean that's where we're going to end up in the decade ahead. As always has been the case and always will be the case, these times call for a new kind of leader. Civically active, socially conscious leaders in all 3 sectors that are ready to define the leader they need to be for the most inequitable, complex America that we have faced in nearly 100 years. That's all. And just to want to be clear, my book is not so much leadership about strategy or teams or culture. It is about the kinds of leaders that we need to reverse the inequities that are facing America today. So one of those people I talked to you about was Roseanne Haggerty. Just a little bit about her real quick and generosity mindset. So she runs a group called Community Solutions. They're out of New York City. They work all over the country. Their mission is to create a lasting end to homelessness that leaves no one behind. That's all. When I was talking to her about 2 years ago when she was walking down the streets of New York City on her phone, when people used to walk down the streets of New York City, we were talking about leadership and how they went into communities and worked with these complex problems and competing interests on a problem as complex as homelessness. And I said, what's the most important leadership attribute? And she said, oh, generosity mindset. I didn't know kind of what that meant. I'd never heard that phrase. I didn't expect that to hear that from somebody working on homelessness. And what she proceeded to do over the next 20 minutes walking down the street was explain to me sort of all the nuance on how she approaches working with communities. She's been doing this for 30 years. You talk about climbing mountains, that's a mountain to climb. It's about looking for what each person has to share or give. It's about getting the most from everyone. It's about keeping your eyes on the ultimate goal and getting past all the noise and all the diversion. Every 4 years, the National Intelligence Council out of the White House issues a report about the risks in the decade ahead. The most recent one they wrote, the closing line said this: the scarcest resource in the decade ahead won't be oil or rare earth minerals. It's going to be social trust. It's a pretty profound statement. Leaders with generosity mindset, they are masters of social trust. That is their currency. And just to be clear, a generosity mindset leader, it's not about nicey nice. It's not about, sort of like playing good with everybody. It's actually a very hard-edged strategy. It comes from a position of strength. It's a deeply and fiercely held conviction. Of those 5 traits, it is the most obvious when it's missing from a team or a meeting or a community. It is also these days the most unique, therefore the most valuable. And it's also the hardest one to put into practice. Last comment on Roseanne and Community Solutions. They have ended chronic or veteran homelessness in 14 communities around the country, and they have reduced the incidence of it in dozens more. So she walks the talk. We can accept the world as it is, or we can find and we can build up more leaders with a generosity mindset like Roseanne Haggerty. Last thought, and then I'll have a conversation with John. At the end of the day, this conversation, the book, it's not even about me. It's not about John. It's about all of us that are ready to redefine the leader we need to be in the most complex and equitable America in nearly 100 years. The title's intentional. It's about us being proactive about that. It's about leaning into the times that we're living in. I wrote about 38 rebuilders because I wanted everyone that reads this to be able to see themselves in at least some people in that book as a role model that would enable you to take action. Thinking about yourself, your teams, your organization that you're part of. That's what I want folks to do with this. Let me read one paragraph out of the introduction of the book, and I'll dive in here with John. America is at a looming inflection point. COVID and racial unrest brought us even more abruptly to a massive reset for America and for our leadership. Like all change, our times call for our cause for uncertainty. There are also opportunities for new leaders to step forward. Massive upheavals like 2020 can be moments for undoing and expelling old ways of thinking and doing and being. In times like these, leadership is the seminal lever in civil society. Those who show up with these 5 vital traits will not only be rebuilders for the future, I believe they will be genuine American heroes. Thank you all for giving me a few minutes to talk about the book. Even better than that now, I want to have a conversation with John. Mr. Bissell, it's great to see you. How are you doing tonight?
Doing really well. I'm thinking a lot about the things that you just said.
Good, because that's what we're going to talk about. So let's start here sort of like broadly. You and I talked about this a little bit the other day, but you sat there and listened to me for about 12, 13 minutes. You as a leader, what resonated the most for you in what I just talked about?
Yeah, I mean, so first, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. And I'm pretty humbled that at least a couple of you guys thought that I sort of embody some of these values. And I hope I can live up to that over the course of my career. It may take me a little while to do so. But I think, so obviously I'm going to come at it from my perspective, which is a very industrialized kind of perspective. Jesse, you were mentioning that you're not sort of quite sure what Origin does. We're basically a big chemical company, right? We're an aspiring big chemical company, right? We want to be big. And the idea is we have technology that lets us make all of this stuff around us in a different way. And I'm getting to the points that you were just making, Paul. And in order to get to make stuff differently, and by the way, the chemical industry is essentially synonymous with the stuff industry, right? All the stuff that we make things out of is chemicals, right? And so when you think of a company like Dow or DuPont or BASF, which we think of as sort of esoteric chemical companies, what they're really doing is they're making the physical stuff that ultimately everything in our whole life is made out of, right? So they're the companies that make things possible, physical things possible. And the problem is, right, of course, that's a good thing, right? Materials are really tightly and inextricably tied to us as a species. All of the things, we even call the sort of evolution of our species by the materials that are used, the Stone Age, the Iron Age, right, the Bronze Age. And so what's challenging about that is if you want to make changes, right, in the way that we make materials and therefore do so many things, you can't just rebuild the entire, or at least I haven't figured out how you can just rebuild the entire technology stack solo, right? You can't, in the same way that you might say, well, I want to make a different, I'll probably be unfair here to software, but if you say I want to build a new communication app, I just build WhatsApp, right? And I build it like almost, in a silo, unrelated to many of the other things that are going on. Now, that's not quite fair, right? It has to have data permissions and all these kinds of things and transfer information around, but I don't have to go back and re-engineer texts, right? I don't have to integrate retrospectively with my SMS service in order to build a new technology stack, WhatsApp. That's not true with materials, right? If we're going to change the way that we make materials so that we're not pulling oil out and that we're not emitting a bunch of CO2 when we do it, and we're not making materials that have a bunch of toxic crap in there that you've got to that is over time poisoning sort of animals and the human species, right? Then you actually have to work with most of that ecosystem. There's this big legacy ecosystem of steel in the ground and buildings and factories and people and businesses that have invested literally trillions of dollars in order to make stuff. And if we're going to change things, we have to work with that, right? We have to plug into that. We have to understand how that ecosystem works and then build our technology in the right spot and that integrates in the right way with all of that existing legacy infrastructure, that legacy foundation and superstructure, right? All of it, because we can't just rebuild it all from scratch. And so I think that's sort of the angle that I think of this from, right? Because that's my experience. And so when you talk about all of those different things, it's incredibly, it connects really powerfully for me, right? So one is, I could go through each one of these, right? But I'll pick out sort of cross-sector fluency and complexity in particular, right? So I think what's really important in our industry with cross-sector fluency, right, is one, there's a really complicated and important relationship between government agencies, right, in the materials industry that say, look, you can make that and you can't make that, and you can't make that because it's dangerous, right? And at the same time that they're trying to protect us from all the right things, they also say, well, if it's new, I don't know about it and it might be dangerous, right? And it's their job, and they should put a pretty high hurdle, right? For
30, 40, 50 years ago, we didn't ask these questions, right? We just,
right.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Yeah, it was started with the Clean Water Act, right?
Yeah.
And it's a really good thing. But at the same time, if you have a bunch of structure and regulation on something, it makes it harder to change, right?
Yep.
Yeah, right again. So second thing is, you've got a lot of nonprofits and NGOs, right, which are trying to say, hey, let's keep an eye on what people are doing.
Yep.
And that's a good thing.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it also means that that's another part of the system that you got to be able to engage with, right? Yep. And then you also have the private industrial companies, right, which are actually making all of this stuff. And you not only want to replace some of them and compete with them, outcompete them, but you want to work with other parts of them, sometimes in the same company, right?
Yep.
And so working through that whole ecosystem is, one, it took, I certainly wouldn't say that I have mastered how to do that, but it is required and has taken a ton of time and understanding, and there's a lot in there. And the second thing that jumped out to me, well, again, all of your items jumped out, but the other complexity theory, right, or capability with complexity is it's fascinating to me because there is so much about the industrial ecosystem that is not known. And it is so big and so complicated that there is no single human being who knows how it all functions exactly, right? It's not knowable in that sense, right? It's just too large. And yet we have to change it, right? And so the thing that frankly, my team and I deal with regularly is how do I impact and affect and interact with the system when I have a goal for how I want the system to look at the end, and yet I don't know, and nobody actually knows exactly how this system functions, right? That's like classic complexity.
Yep.
And so those two jump out to me in particular.
Awesome. That's great. And thanks for setting the framework for what you guys do. We all needed that context. So quick comment on both those. Cross-sector fluency. Just like hearing John talk about the way he did 30, 40 years ago, there weren't any leaders like that. It just wasn't part of the dialogue, right? 20, 25 years ago, we started sort of having some greenwashing. Then CSR came in. In the last 5 to 10 years now, this cross-sector stuff, like this is real. You build a business that inherently has to be that way, and you have to be cross-sector fluent, right? So it's amazing to watch the evolution. The comments coming to the chat are all sort of like talking about this. The evolution of how we got here is, or especially over the last 10 years. And in 2020, man, if you weren't cross-sector fluent in about any industry, you had to get that way really fast. And then on complexity, just a footnote on that one. I don't know if we don't have to talk about it, I have to agree or disagree. I have a subsection of that chapter called "You Better Have Women in the Room." So my belief, I'm not saying this for my wife or my two sisters, just on average in general, women are better at complexity than guys are. That's just my belief. But the thing you said about the team, when it comes to complexity, for sure, it's about the whole, it's about having the different genders, perspectives, ethnicities in the room so the team can think complex, not just you as an individual, but the whole team. So great thoughts. I'm curious about your leadership style. So you kind of referenced it, but how have you had to shift your leadership? You've been at this thing for about 10 years or so. How's your leadership style had to evolve over that time from where you started to where you are today? You got to be a different leader now than you were at the start.
Yeah, I think the more we have, as we grow up as a company, right? You start and it's like, how do I develop an analytical value proposition, and how do I think I'm going to engage with the network? But you're not actually doing it yet, right?
Yep.
And you figure out the science, and that's a highly analytical exercise. And engineering's also analytical, less analytical, interestingly, than the science, right? But and then by the time we're at commercial scale, we're interacting with all these different stakeholders in the environment. The how I've had to be is completely different, right? In the beginning, it was all what I would call like insight driven. How do I take in information and digest it and sort of try to provide some sort of intellectual value add to the rest of the team, and the rest of the team's doing the same thing, right? Which is basically, that's like the pleasure of figuring things out, right? How do I go through here and digest the information and try to come up with a better solution? Which and in some ways that hasn't changed, but in a lot of ways it's changed completely, right? Because at this point, it's not so much about me generating some sort of insight by thinking hard. It's me pulling the right people into the room, right? Asking the right kinds of questions, making sure to moderate conversations in the right kind of way, right? Moderate meaning if we get off on like some crazy bird walk or somebody's venting or whatever it is, with really different kinds of folks with different incentives and drivers and all that kind of stuff. And how do you pull that together in a way that you can have a productive conversation that is still going towards the goal, right? And sometimes I do that well, and sometimes I don't do it well, right? But it's obvious that's how it has to be in a lot of ways,
It's very cool. It takes time to learn this stuff, right?
Yeah, I'm curious from your perspective, how do you see these kinds of traits get manifested differently across these sectors? And I'm curious, there's public, private, nonprofit, right? But they're also in different industries, so you see, and those are quite different as well, right? I'm curious how that manifests. You talk to all these folks.
And man, the reason you do this, I like this with the Carlson Center, so you can have the stuff going to the chat. It's awesome. Just reading what folks are thinking about. So here's what I would say about it. It's a little bit like your evolution as a leader, I think. And again, this is one guy's perspective on this. I think 15, 20, 25 years ago, I think like how those things played out in different industries was different. A, because you didn't have to be as cross-sector fluent to begin with. B, the complexity of different industries was highly variable, highly different. The amount of variables you had to deal with and sort of control for, I think, were probably more staid and easy in some industries than other ones. So I think it used to be a lot sort of more segregated. The biggest difference between the private sector and the nonprofit public sector to me is two things. One, the private sector has this bottom line thing called the profit. And number two, the customer that uses the product usually pays for it. So you have these two incredible market signals that the other two sectors just don't have as much of. That's my oversimplified view of the difference between the two. So that still exists. But what I'll say is, and especially in the last 5 to 10 years now, the market signals that a for-profit has to pay attention to, and you are a perfect example of it, is yes, you got to pay attention to your customer. Yes, you got to pay attention to your profit, probably primarily, but you now got a bunch of other signals you got to be paying attention to. So I think the way these traits play out across sector and across industries, they'll always have nuances, they'll always have differences, but I do think there is quite a bit of convergence, and not just in that cross-sector fluency, but the notion of needing to navigate complexity. I don't know if I said this in the book, but what I also would say is, in some ways, nonprofits are almost greater masters of complexity than for-profits are. Bill Gates said this about 10 years ago when he started his foundation. He said, that's actually a harder thing to do than to run Microsoft. Yeah. And the problem is because he doesn't have clear enough signals. So I think another way in which this stuff is blurred is the complexity that nonprofits are used to, for-profits now have to deal with, to understand it. They sort of like see this complexity of this stuff now. So in general, there'll always be differences, but the degree to which those traits play out differently across sectors is converged, it's merged up more. And I would say in the future going forward, it'll merge up even more. And my last comment is, I think leaders, for the leaders like you that are in a company, you have to be cross-sector fluent because that's your business. I think having more people that are cross-sector fluent in companies that are not even so much in the thick of it like you are, it's going to make our world a better and a stronger place, because companies, there's this idea of not just shareholder capitalism, but stakeholder capitalism. And companies, what's awesome is they not only have to care about the environment and social issues, et cetera, because it's a good thing to do, it's because it's a profitable thing to do. And we sort of crossed over to that. And I think for a long time, we talked about getting to this. I think in the last 3 to 5 years, it's literally become that way. And the number one thing is they cannot acquire talent, retain it, and develop it. The kinds of people on this call that are coming out of college, if a company doesn't have that sense of social purpose and that cross-sector fluency, they're not going to be able to hire and attract and retain talent. So thanks for the question. I'm a little bit like you, like I get jazzed up and I get cranked up on the answer to the question.
So you just mentioned something, by the way, we have absolutely seen that, right? So we are pulling talent from, like, it's like the fish are jumping in the boat right now. I mean, we're getting talent from,
I bet you are.
It's like unheard of.
Yeah.
Right? We would have had to work 3 years to identify that person and like pry them out of a major chemical company. And now over the last 18 months, it's like the whole world has shifted. And what you're talking about is the talent is moving to where the companies are doing what they wanted to do, right? So totally agree. I'm curious. So one of the things you just mentioned is that talent is behaving differently now. And a lot of that, I think, is because you have a new generation that, frankly, in that sense, is leading the way, I think. And it's a different crew. And one of the sort of assumptions in there that's inherent is the sort of tranche or the cohort that's coming through has different characteristics and can start to win in ways that the old cohort didn't, right? So, in my experience generally is that cohorts are somewhat consistent in that way. But I'm curious your view, because you've talked to all these folks. So I'm sure that leadership has changed over the last 20 years. You mentioned a couple of ways that it does.
Don't throw me too far into the bus here, man.
Yeah, one of my friends, has in private, and I won't name his name, but has said in private that he thinks a lot of the really senior leaders of the sort of old industry companies are not familiar with the things that you're talking about. And some of these global shocks are going to not change them as leaders, but will change who the leaders are.
Yep.
And I'm curious, one, what do you think about that assessment? And two, how have you seen in your discussions with people the leadership style change? Are you seeing people change in their style? Are you seeing different leaders show up? How does it manifest?
Yeah. So the answer to the first part of your question is almost to listen to what you just said about the last 18 months of talent, right? Like you answered part of the question right there. for me. I don't think there's any doubt that it's changed, and the rate at which the way people have to lead is changing radically. And folks of my generation, right, they either have a facile brain or they don't. I had this, one of the other 38 people in the book, he's a big jazz fan. He gave me this analogy about jazz pianists. And he said, metaphorically, we have a lot of existing leaders who are technically proficient, but not agile enough for tomorrow's complexity.
Yeah.
The best jazz pianists are both technically good and creatively agile.
Yeah.
So leaders that can't adapt, they're absolutely, they're going to fall out because they can't attract the talent. What I think is good though is an awful lot of leaders. I was just on a call today with the National Association of Corporate Directors, and it was a conversation about diversity, equity, inclusion. And there were 6 people on that panel, and the conversation they were having, and they were all folks in their 50s, 60s. 3 of them were African-American, 1 was an Asian-American, 2 of them were white people, mix of genders. And the conversation they were having versus 2 years ago was fundamentally different. So I think the answer is it's shifting because of all the sort of like normal things that are happening. I don't think you can underestimate how much 2020 changed stuff.
Yeah.
You can maybe be a little bit hyperbolic about it, but it's actually true. 2020 shifted the damn bell curve, and it ain't going back. And companies like yours and leaders like you were sort of already moving the bell curve by the nature of what you do. There's an awful lot of companies that had to shift in 2020, and they are not going to shift back because their talent won't let them, the market won't let them, their customers won't let them, private capital won't let them. Private capital is starting to ask, what's your ESG, right? When the dude that runs Blackstone starts asking about, my capital, does my capital have a conscience? Like, stuff is changing. And the last example, the best example I'll give that to you, John, is I did a project in the 4th quarter last year with a group in Oakland called Policy Link. And their focus is on economic and racial equity. And I talked to about 40 to 50 CEOs. The report's going to get published next week, and I'll send a link to you guys so you can send it around to your students. But what I was asking them about was, after this summer, what's the state of racial equity in your company? And I talked to a lot of CEOs before that, and there was just a fundamentally different conversation. Number one, I heard the word listen more out of CEOs' mouths than I ever heard it, I think, in the history of my life combined. I heard it out of those 40 CEOs more than I ever heard it before. And where they're at on racial equity is, I think, a great example of where they have to be on a lot of other causes and a lot of issues. They don't have any choice. And the great thing about it, I said this earlier, was not only are they doing it because it's the right thing to do or a good thing to do, they're doing it because they have to. So I could be a little bit sort of, reactionary to 2020. I think 2020 shifted a lot of stuff that's not going back. And I think in some ways, for all the bad things that happened in 2020, one of the good things is I think it sort of shifted the social consciousness of a lot of companies. I'm curious for you at Origin Materials. So you guys got to think about the future now. Your leadership's evolved. When you look at the next decade ahead, I wrote a book about sort of here's the challenges of the decade. Here's how I think leaders should respond to it. What's the challenge in the decade ahead for you, for your company, and for you as a leader when you look forward?
Yeah, I think so. So one of the things, there are a couple of different things that come to mind there. One is, you've seen all these sort of net zero commitments that these companies are making, right? Unilever is going to start putting their carbon footprint on their products, right? Apple, Microsoft, like all these companies I've got a page in my deck, right? That's like 50 companies that have all said they're going to be net zero carbon emissions by 2030, 40, 50. And Larry Fink, right, the CEO of BlackRock, many trillion-dollar asset manager, right, one of the largest in the world, basically said, look, hey, he writes a letter to CEOs in the first quarter of every year, and he says, hey, if you're not taking climate change seriously, I'm not going to take you seriously, right? Which is a big deal. And what's interesting is we look at all this stuff and we look at companies making these net zero commitments, and I think some of them don't understand yet, but there's so much work that they're going to have to do to hit that commitment. It's shocking, right? It is enormous amounts. I'm talking, billions of dollars of capital investment. That's going to many billions of dollars. And by the way, it's all extremely profitable capital investment, right? It is capital investment that it's people are going to be happy to do it, right? But the speed and scale at which that's going to have to happen, and basically, if you look out there right now, we're kind of the only option for about 10% of that trillions, frankly, dollars of capital spending that's going to happen in the next 20 or 30 years. There isn't something else.
That's enough to make a company off of.
Yeah, it turns out. And so we're looking at that, and part of that's like, oh, that's awesome. I have unlimited demand. I can, from a business perspective, it's like, this is great. From an impact perspective, my God, I really, if we're gonna do what we set out to do, which is help to achieve like the net zero commitments and needs essentially of the human species, I have got to figure out how to build an unholy amount of facilities, right? I mean, this is like this is World War II type resourcing of capital, right? And so when I look at that from a leadership perspective, one, I mean, we're not even a 100-person company yet. Yeah, I've raised $1 billion. Great. But I need the people to go do that. Fish are jumping in the boat, even better, right? I'm getting talent all the time. But the scale of that challenge is daunting, right? Not just to be profitable, right? To be profitable is that's probably not even, it's hard, but it's not that hard, right? But to try to actually solve the problem that we set out to do, now that everybody's sort of recognizing it, that's a whole nother level. And what makes it, I think, even more challenging here is the world kind of hasn't done this kind of scale up and build out since sort of maybe the 60s. In an industrial capacity kind of way, not at least in the historically considered developed world. And so figuring out how to build that ecosystem to move that fast in our industry, which is big industry, that's going to be a hell of a leadership challenge.
Yep, no question. Hey, Jesse, he and I can keep rolling here. At some point, if you want to jump in and start asking us stuff, just interrupt.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
So I'll open the floor. If anyone in the audience has any questions, please put them in the chat and I will take them in and throw them to Paul and John. I will start with a question that I think might be interesting, not only to the students in the room, but everyone in the room and myself included, is, you've identified these 5 different traits. Some are skill sets, some are ways of being. How do you suggest someone who wants to be a leader for the future go about learning and getting good at this stuff?
Yep. And I want to answer Billy's question in the chat, by the way. Billy, it's on page 9 of the book. So you want to know the answer to that quote, it's on the middle of page 9 of the book. A couple of things I'm going to say. Tactically, I literally this week, I just finished a discussion guide. So I'm going to give that to you. You can send that out to everybody. It's a way to sort of start to think about how to use this stuff. Here's the main way I would say to do it. And I mentioned this kind of in my comments. I think the framework I would use is think about you as an individual, think about your teams, and think about your organizations. At an individual level, some of it's about honest self-assessment. All 5 of those traits, they're not black and white, but they have definitions. They have examples, they have traits. I'm actually working with a couple of learning and development companies to sort of align their curriculum to those traits, to give people an actionable way to do it. I will say, short of me sort of having a few of those things in place, I used it myself to do my own sort of like self-assessment and thought about those characteristics and the definitions and the examples in the book about myself. It was very clear to me, my strength is cross-sector fluency, my weakness is complexity capacity. So I could use that assessment on myself, and now I can think about how I want to develop those traits now in my career based on assessment. It's maybe even more powerful as a team. This kind of stuff John talked about. I mean, it's exhilarating, and B, it's like, holy smokes, like how the hell? I know you're a smart guy and you got all this stuff in your bio, but you don't have a chance in hell of solving that stuff by yourself, right? So I think looking at our teams and saying, what do what do we have on our team that we need that's missing? And this generosity mindset thing I mentioned with the example of Roseanne Haggerty, again, and it's not a thing about being nice. It's about how you sort of like have an abundance mindset. It's I have a whole grain in the sum of its parts mindset. You better think like John's thinking about how to solve a big problem like that. I think there's a lot of people, a lot of leaders in our world that they're thinking more narrowly than they used to. Clearly, as a society, we're more siloed, we are more narrow thinking. So that's a problem about society. So I think finding more people on your teams that have that mindset. I did a podcast, episode 8 is Cecilia Gutierrez. She could teach a master class on this stuff, and just understand how she approaches it is so critical. So I think how you think about your team and you have people, each of those traits on the team is even a more actionable way to do it. So I'm gonna have a discussion guide, which I will send to you, Jesse and Cameron. You can send it out to everybody.
Great.
I'm working with a couple of learning and development companies, but I love the question. I don't want people to just read this thing and think about it. I really, truly want them to act on it.
I love that.
You know, there's something I was just thinking about while you're talking about that, Paul. I think on our team, when we've seen, and obviously, I didn't have your book years ago, so I didn't have a chance to read through that and use it.
Yeah.
But when we've seen people on our team really grow as leaders in this kind of way that we're talking about, it's often because they have really frank, sort of full contact with reality.
Yeah.
In these different areas that you're talking about. And it's almost like a natural response, painful, right? The growth is painful.
No question.
It's a natural response to being fully engaged with all of these stakeholders in a very real way, you know?
And so I'm playing off what you said, of course, but this thing about authenticity to me, again, in society in general, I think we can look around and we can say, at least in the public sector, we have less leaders that are authentic these days, right? We can say that for sure. And I think of the value of people that are willing to have that kind of sort of critical observation, critical conversation, and willing to have that much sort of openness to what's real and be authentic about it. I think their value is going to be that much greater in the world. And places and companies that create a culture around authenticity, again, they're going to attract talent. They're going to be able to solve more complex problems. But I love that as an example of it. We haven't talked as much about authenticity. I feel incredibly strongly about that. And it's not just like honesty is the best policy. It's to be a leader today, you have to be so transparent. You don't have any choice. You are transparent whether you want to be or not.
Yep.
So you might as well decide, not just for ethical reasons, but for practical reasons, that you're going to be transparent from the get-go. And I just think the bar for that and the importance of that has gone up so much, even just in the last 5 years.
Yeah. Yeah. It's sort of like the Streisand effect is what happens when people try to, suppress the enforced transparency, right?
That's good. That's good. I like it. Any more on your end, Jesse? I can keep going here with John.
Sure. We've had a handful of things in the chat.
Yep.
So one, Rachel would love to hear more about the capacity for complexity.
Yeah. So, you know what? To some ways, a great case study. This is the guy I'm talking to right here. There's so many metrics in this world about how much more complex the world's gotten just in the last 5 to 10 years, the amount of data we have, et cetera, et cetera. And by the way, one of the manifestations to me of the amount of complexity we have is also, you look at the mental health situation in the US, there's a degree to which complexity is really kind of overwhelming us as leaders and as citizens and as people. So that, again, puts more of a premium, I think, even on that as a leadership attribute. But to me, the capacity for it is the ability to not just sort of like take it in, but process it, interpret it, and decide what parts of it to act on. And there's sort of a simplicity in that statement. Just the amount of inputs and the amount of variables that you have to deal with today versus 5 years ago, or even 10 years ago, is so much more. And I think the companies that have the people that can do that and process that complexity are going to have that much more of a competitive advantage. Hopefully, probably more mentally healthy people as well. And my comment about women in the room, I've lived it so many times in the last 10 years. I walk into a room, I've walked with lots of different clients in the last 6 years in the healthcare industry and the learning and development industry, did some stuff with Microsoft, a couple of foundations. And I'm telling you, if I walk in the room and I just see a bunch of guys, I'm already skeptical. Mark Benioff, who's the CEO of Salesforce, who kind of knows what he's talking about, he said, I don't want to do any meetings anymore without a third of the room being women. There's nothing sort of like, politically correct about that, period. I just think that women are better at complexity on average than guys are. So that was a little bit of a 2 or 3 dimensional answer to your question. It's a great one. I could talk about that one all night long, but that's just a few thoughts on capacity for complexity.
What do you think? Do you mind if I ask you, Paul?
Go.
It struck me when you were talking about that one of the things, and particularly your mental health comment, I think is a really relevant one. So one of the interesting aspects of complexity that we found or capacity for complexity, is that you actually have to be able to deal with both ambiguity and failure. Because almost by definition, technical definition of complexity is that it's very difficult to predict the outcome of a given specific action.
Yeah.
Is ambiguity, right? Yep. That's synonymous. And it also means if something is highly ambiguous and you have difficulty sort of wandering around in that space and predicting what's going to happen, it means that you're going to fail sometimes. And I sort of wonder if there's a relationship on the mental health angle between we live in a world where you're to be considered successful, you often are supposed to be able to predict what's going to happen next. Yeah. Right? I want to know that food's going to be delivered, that I'm not going to get sick, that I'm going to that all these things are that my life, when I graduate with a 4.0 from my school, that I'm going to get accepted to these different places and I'm going to have a good job, right? These are all every time I say gonna, right? That's and I wonder, first, what do you think about that? But second, what are the other sort of characteristics of complexity capacity in your view, from both from all your discussions and thinking about it so much?
You said it pretty dang well. I'm not going to change your definition there too much. This is we could talk about this one all night long, right? It is a leadership attribute, and I am genuinely worried about all the stuff you just said about how people are willing to accept failure, learn from failure, that the world thinks you need to have your answers, sort of all laid out for you before you get to the solution right now. So it worries me at a human level, not just a sort of a management leadership level. As far as what else goes into it, there's, what's the quote? It's Einstein. You're looking for the simplicity on the other side of complexity.
Yeah.
The one other aspect I would say, and I know this has got to be one of your challenges as a leader, is how can the capacity for complexity is about digesting it on the other side and making it simple enough that people can do something about it and do something with it. A really good friend of mine from Microsoft, he was literally one of the 3 guys that convinced Bill Gates the internet mattered back in like the late 90s. He's kind of famous for that. He said, I am so worried about the pace of technology, just with my kids and kids of that age, like their ability to take it in and process it. And he said, how do I sort of simplify the world for my own kids, not just like people that work for me? So he's really, the notion of how do you identify the simplicity that goes along with that complexity, I think that's sort of another dimension of that problem.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, that's sort of the leading part, I guess, for complexity in some ways, right?
In some ways, yeah. But it's a hell of an issue, not just for companies, but for citizens and for all of us, right, in the world. I'm interested. You got a whole bunch of young leaders on the call here today. If you got your platform here for a minute, like what would you tell them to be thinking about as leaders coming out of college and sort of heading out in the work world? Like what leadership traits and what sort of leadership development do you want to see out of people coming into your companies when they're coming right out of college? Does anything sort of jump out to you, like advice to give to these guys on the call here?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, it's funny. Since I read portions of your book and you're thinking about it here, it's really stuck with me. So in some ways, you sort of supplanted what I maybe thought about as the key characteristics of leadership before, which is good. But I think when you say what about our what about our company specifically? What are we looking for? I think there are three really clear characteristics that we're always looking for. This is true whether they're fresh out of college or not.
Yeah.
And they actually line up. We've said these for years, but they line up pretty closely with some of the stuff that you talk about.
Good.
But one is, first one is you've got to care, right? Whatever you're doing, you got to care about it. People who come in and they don't really care about the quality of the work or the impact of the work, we almost just don't know, as a company, we don't know how to talk to them, right?
Yep.
It's like they're missing a core driver. And that's a really hard thing, right? So caring about the output, right? What happens and how you do something is almost beaten out of people over time, because it's so challenging to care deeply about something and then for it not to turn out the way you wanted, or to fail in your execution of the process or the how.
Yep.
Is one, it's inevitable, right?
Yep.
It's always going to happen that way. And yet the easiest defense is to decide that you don't care about it, right? Which is so damaging. So that's the first thing for us, is you've got to care deeply about what is happening and what you do. The second is, and I think that transcends just being on our team, right? I think that's true.
Yeah.
I think you've got to have courage. And the courage in this particular case is of course it's vulnerability, right? It's your 24/7 authenticity in a lot of ways. But it's which means willingness to tell people that they're wrong, right? Even though that may be an uncomfortable thing. And by the way, telling somebody wrong doesn't mean that you're right.
No.
You may tell somebody that they're wrong, and that's a very courageous thing to do. And you may in fact find out that you didn't understand the problem as well as you thought you did, right? And so, but telling people that they're wrong, especially when it's going to be an unpleasant result for that person, again, doesn't mean that you're right, but you damn well better have that conversation.
Yep.
Right. And the third thing from our perspective, and I think this gets lost a lot for some reason in conversations generally, is you've got to have competence, right? And competence in this case doesn't mean that you're good at everything, of course, right? That's never the case. But when you have done something, right, you had better understand what happened. I shouldn't say understand. You should better remember what happened. Yep. Why you made the decisions that you did. Why did you do what you did, right? Why did you take certain risks, and how did they turn out? And what do you think about that, right? I mean, you may not understand why it turned out why it did, but you should understand what you think about. Would you do it that way again, even though it turned out that way, or would you not? And being thoughtful about it. And this really shows up for us, not because I want to be able to say, hey, Paul, tell me exactly how to turn somebody into a leader, right? But it's more, hey, Paul, you wrote the book. Why did you choose these?
Yeah.
Right.
What was your thought process?
Yeah. And I'll tell you what, there are so many people who can't do that. And there are so many reasons why. But those are our three big ones.
And I assume it's no coincidence they all start with a C. So those are your 3 C's, right?
So I didn't even think about that.
Oh, really? Well, there you go. Come on, man. Care, courage, competence. Jesus, I thought it was it.
Branded.
There you go.
For us, right?
Trademark it.
What
else you got, Jesse?
I'd love to actually flip that question on its head. For the students in the audience who are looking to get an internship or a job, how do you evaluate a company or a nonprofit or some organization in the public sector and differentiate between an organization that says they do these things and one who truly lives by these values?
You asking the folks on the call, or are you asking us?
I'm asking you guys, I guess. Maybe a better way of asking the question is, Paul, like what outcomes do these organizations have that someone from the outside could look at and say, okay, I think that this organization lives by these values?
Yep.
That's a great
So we haven't talked, when I was doing the work on these 5 traits, the last one I added was this thing I called data conviction. And it was, the last one was partly because it's sort of like not as sexy as sounding of an idea. But every time I kept going back to these people that were great, all these other attributes, they also have that. So I'm going to answer your question, but Roseanne Haggerty is a great example. So she works on homelessness. They are the most, she's a generosity mindset. She's an incredibly strategic thinker. She's an extremely authentic thinker, and they are obsessed with data. At the end of the day, they can't reduce homelessness if they don't have the data to do it with. And this is a nonprofit problem, right? In general, right? We know how hard it is to get data, but at some point in time, if you can't bring data into the equation, I don't know how you can ultimately solve sort of any problem that's out there. So I think the way folks that are sort of like trying to evaluate an organization is you can look at a lot of subjective factors, and then where's their data? What's the data say? Does the data look right? Does it look authentic? Try to get underneath the data and say, where does this data come from? And does the data really say something to me about the problem I'm trying to solve? So if I'm trying to solve homelessness, what are they measuring? Are they just measuring inputs? Are they just measuring meals served, which is good? Or are they actually trying to measure ways in which we've reduced the incidence of homelessness in a city? The amount of people that are on our homelessness roll have gotten reduced. So have rigor about the data that you look at. Do they have it? And does the data really speak to the mission and the problem I'm trying to solve, whether it's John's company or a nonprofit like Roseanne Haggerty's? The data is less sexy, and it's the ultimate sort of absolutely necessary but not sufficient part of the equation. But you got to have data.
I think one of the places where I think you get it when you engage.
You're known as Data Man at Fast Pitch?
I was known as Data Man at Fast Pitch, yeah.
Okay, I should have had you answer the question then.
No. Well, I think I totally agree with everything you just said, by the way. I was going to answer your question from a different angle, which is as sort of as a prospective employee, right, or member of the team at a company, how do I assess that? I think it's a really, really interesting question. And what struck me was there's a book. There are two books by Ben Horowitz that I think are fantastic. But one of them is it's about company culture, and the title of the book is "What You Do Is Who You Are." Right?
Yeah.
It's not what you talk about. It's not what you want to do. It's what you do. And I think that there is the best way to understand a company is to engage with them in some fashion, right? So the interview process, how they treat you, that's what they're going to do when you get in too, right? And I think that tells you that the interview is absolutely two ways, which is sort of trite, but it's not, because, I mean, you can ask them questions, right? But how that company treats you, what's their level of transparency?
Yeah.
Do they treat you like a human or a cog, right? Like, I think that is really, really important stuff. And I'll give you a couple examples from us. So we don't do it right all the time, right? I'll tell you exactly right now, dead on, we're slow.
Yeah.
Like when we're moving people through our recruiting pipe, we're slow. We want to get to know you really well. You're going to talk to more people than you needed to, because we like to have, you're joining our team. We're going to be pretty committed to investing in you and making you happen. And that means that we really want to know that you're good.
Hire slow, fire fast.
Yeah. And but that tells you a lot actually about our culture, right?
Yeah.
And another thing we do is if somebody invests a bunch of their time in us, right, and we don't hire you, we're going to tell you why. And it's not going to be feedback that makes you feel great. It's going to be genuinely what we thought and why we didn't give you an offer. But that's us, right? Some people hate it. They're like, why did you, like, you already didn't hire me. I didn't know why you didn't hire me, right? But that's who we are. We tell you, you may not want it, but when you walk away, you're going to learn something, right? We didn't hire you because you didn't respond to this engineering problem very well. In fact, you responded in a way that was pretty dangerous, right?
Yep. Yeah.
And I think that those are just two examples. Those aren't like magical things, but we're telling you who we are as an organization when you interact with us, you know?
I love the last point. That's a great, it's a great case study of 24/7 authenticity, right? Like, how authentic am I, not with the people I hire, but how authentic am I with the people I don't hire? And by the way, I want to come back in like 3 years and see, as you scale, are you able to hang on to that practice?
Oh, we're trying.
It'll get trickier, right?
Yeah.
But I hope you do. Whenever I didn't hire somebody, I thought it was as important to call that person. Don't send them an email. Like, the way you treated someone you didn't hire was almost as important as some you did hire, right? Because in part, not because it's just what it says to that person, but what it says back to your company, your culture.
Yeah, there's still a human that you care about, right?
Correct. Correct.
Or you chose to hire them or not.
Yep, exactly. What else you got, Jesse?
It's so interesting how all of these traits lead back into each other as we're talking through them.
I think so.
Yeah, it's really cool. I'd actually kind of like to go back to one of the topics we were talking about towards the beginning of your conversation and in the chat. There was a lot of talk about partnerships. And I'd love for, I don't know what the right question is, but the concept to me of cross-sector fluency and as well capacity for complexity, how do we apply those things to create better partnerships for our future?
Why don't you start? You were touching on, you got to hang around nonprofits and public sector. How do you guys think about those partnerships? And then I'll throw in on behind you.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and we don't always get it right.
Yeah.
I think there are a couple things. So I think that you have to forge partnerships that are effective with transparency. We've definitely screwed that up before. And that's really hard. It sounds easy, and it's really not. And part of that is because you have to learn enough about the other organization that you can speak their language and you understand what they're saying.
Yeah.
But you also have to trust them, even if they're giving you the information, right? So I think that's challenging. And I think that because of the legacy sort of relationships between, in particular, NGOs and industrial companies in our sector, right? Like, though, I won't pick any specific nonprofit, but like the NGOs don't trust the big chemical companies, right? I don't think that's going to surprise anybody. Yep. And yet, you've really got to sit down at the table and say, okay, well, how do we answer this question? So, and if the NGO says, well, you just can't have plastics, right? There are a whole bunch of reasons why that's a really bad idea, right? Yes, there are places where it doesn't make sense. Totally agree, right? Yep. There are also places where we can make a lot better. That would be great. There are also thousands of places where if you remove plastics, it is a massive catastrophic failure of society from a hygienic perspective, from a, your alternate substance that you're going to use is far worse than plastics. But you've got to build the capacity to have that conversation as two organizations. And that is really, really hard, right? And that's where I think your generosity mindset comes to play, right?
That's an interesting example. Somebody way back earlier on, they said something about socialist values and capitalist something. I like the idea. I will say this, one thing I'm really encouraged about, and we've talked about this before. I'm a guy that's hung out in the nonprofit and the public sector a lot the last 20 years. If a company in America can make money doing something, they will do it. So I think your company's a great example of it. I'm 10 years ago or whatever it is before you, there are probably people thinking about doing what you did, and they're trying to figure out how to create a nonprofit to do it with, right? And people think about nonprofit for-profit as a mission choice. It's not a mission choice, it's a capital choice. So the sort of thought I would add on to what John just said, Jesse, is I think the more creatively people will think about how to deploy capital against a problem, the better. The fact that private capital now has a conscience, that's progress, right? The fact that a company like John's can show up to solve a problem with a private sector company, if you can solve a problem with a private sector company, do it. It just will scale better. It will function more efficiently. The reason why we have a nonprofit, a private sector, public sector is because you can't solve everything with the private sector. But if you can, try to do it that way, because it will just scale and work more efficiently. There's more capital. There's just more functionality in the world for a private sector company. But I think the degree to which a company like John's can do what it does, and the degree to which there are companies trying to get to zero net pollution is awesome. I think that the trend towards the private sector and more capitalist approaches sort of going after social problems, I think it's a really encouraging, good trend. I hope it keeps happening more and more. And if it shouldn't happen, it won't happen because somebody can't make money off of it. But if guys like John can figure out how to make money solving the world's problems, all the better.
Absolutely. I just am sitting in that for a moment because I 100% agree. And I love that these three different sectors are starting to work together and blend what it is to be in those sectors in a way that
again,
we didn't used to see.
Don't confuse for-profit, nonprofit with mission. That's capital. You can be an absolute piece of crap nonprofit and an extremely virtuous for-profit.
So one of the, Monique just put a question in the chat that is, I think, super interesting, and I'm gonna take some editorial license with it.
I was just gonna go there, so take it away.
So Monique stipulated that the pace, process, culture, and skill sets and mandates are incredibly different across the three sectors. I agree with the mandate. I think the pace, process, culture, and skill sets are different. I would stipulate, right, that they are different because of selection, not because they actually need to be different structurally, right, as a result of the sector. I'm just curious what you think about that.
I would buy that. My comment earlier about complexity, I genuinely meant that. I think that the nonprofit sector leaders are better, at least so far, they're better complexity for the most part than for-profits are. Because for-profits they have these simpler market signals. So I think to some degree, we have sort of like, channeled people that if you are A, B, and C, you should be a nonprofit person. If you're D, E, and F, you should be a public sector, et cetera. And the more we can sort of break down those stereotypes of the kind of leaders that ends up in a particular kind of sector, I think we'll have more cross-sector fluent leaders. And we'll also have more people in sort of more parts of our economy that can solve problems in more creative ways. When 20 years ago, 30 years ago, these three sectors were kind of silos. And I don't think there was a lot of problems that could get solved that way. So now our problems are more complex, but I actually feel more sort of encouraged by the breaking down of the silos, because I think it gives a better chance to solve a lot of these social challenges. We just have a more diverse set of human and financial capital to apply against social problems. So I think you're right that sort of, in some way, stereotypes sort of like led people to certain sectors. And my guess is actually students at places like Carlson Center now probably are less wedded to those stereotypes and more sort of apt to go out in the world and sort of take a different capital or different sort of corporate approach to solving a particular problem. That's a very cool question, Monique.
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes me think about, why are we all working on this in the first place? It's for impact, like whatever this is, right? And when you think about different models for having sustainable impact, there's lots of different ways to do it, right? There's not just one model for an end game of sustainable impact. Yep. And the more that we can leverage all the different skills across all those sectors to accomplish those things, the better off we'll be.
The head of the NDRC, National Defense Resources Council, 4 or 5 years ago, I remember seeing a quote. I can't remember who the CEO was at the time, but she said, the number one company on the face of the earth that can have the most to do, this was 5 years ago, can have the most to do to affect the environment positively is Walmart.
Yeah.
And now you probably add Amazon or someone else. But at that time, and it's probably still largely true, they're such a resource hog and can be such a resource reducer. And in the last 5 years, I mean, there's lots of things to dislike about Walmart for sure. But in terms of their resource use and how they think about the environment, they've changed a lot. Mm-hmm. And I think they have a lot more they can do about it. But just having people in one sector be able to think creatively enough about, like, Walmart doesn't just suck because they do a certain thing a certain way, but actually they can be virtuous in one way and not so much another one. I think that's also part of the creativity that leaders have to have when they look around the world to try to solve problems. They got to look unexpected places to solve problems.
Yeah. Great. We have a question in the chat from someone who would like to ask it out loud. So I don't know how to pronounce your name, so I'm not going to mess it up. Okay, great. Go ahead.
Monique actually kind of asked my question, so I will very quickly add to that a little bit. So I'm very specifically thinking about this lithium mine that's trying to go in Nevada. It's the largest, lithium-based in America, and it's very close to a sage grouse habitat. It's close to, there is so many factors here, right? Like you can't, like the environmental advocates can't say, this mine can't go in. I mean, they do. They say this mine can't go in. But if you believe in electric cars, if you believe in battery technology, you need to have lithium, and you need America to have lithium. And then, and then there are the native communities that are impacted by this. So there's so much that's happening, and we've lived in a society where when mines or things like vastly disruptive enterprises go in, it's way after the fact that you're like, well, it's too late to fix the damage that was done. How do you make sure that before it happens, the right people are at the table, and who foots the bill for those right people to be at the table? So, you're talking about them. Yeah. So that's my
awesome question. So that's awesome.
Yeah.
So this actually gets back to some of the sort of like little hanger comments we made earlier, but I'll pick one of them up and run with it, because I think you're nailing a specific example of this problem, which is we don't know, right? So how do you make sure all the people that are there this is my opinion, I can't speak for Paul. How do you make sure they're all going to be there at the table? We won't. We can't make it. Not that we won't try. We're going to try. How do you know they're all going to be there? You don't know. You're going to fuck it up, right? And you have to do it anyway. And there's going to be a point where we have to make trade-offs, right? Every single decision you make in your entire life and that we as a species make has trade-offs in it, right? They're embedded in it. And we don't know the ramifications of those trade-offs. We just don't. We know some. We think we know certain elements of those trade-offs, right? Are we going to destroy the grouse, right? Is it going to die because we put this mine in? Maybe, right? It might be that we lose that species. But we don't know that. It may also be just fine, happy, sort of run around elsewhere else. That's not trying to be Pollyannish, right? We really don't know what the outcome's going to be. Sometimes we convince ourselves that we think we do, but we don't. And the reality is there are a bunch of trade-offs, by the way, that we don't see. Not only do we see certain trade-offs and not know how it will turn out, there are trade-offs that we are completely unaware of. And yet we must still make a decision and act, right? By not doing it, we are still making a decision to not do it. And this is where I think it gets I was mentioning earlier with nonprofits, right? The relationship between the oil companies and I should say oil, the chemical companies, which are different, and NGOs, there's no relationship, right? So they just hammer at each other. Don't kill the grouse, right? You're going to destroy this community. And no, lithium is important. It's a defense requirement. Nobody ever talks, or they talk at each other, not to each other, right?
Yeah.
And there is going to be an answer that will disappoint at least some people, right?
And that'll be the best answer.
Find it, right?
That'll be the best answer. Jesse, that sounds like a great topic for the next one of these things. Like the whole damn thing, right?
Yeah.
I'm conscious of time. I know you're keeping track of time and stuff. I'm also trying to keep track of time here. Should we wrap it, or what do you want to do?
Why don't we do one more question?
Okay.
And we've been talking about capacity for complexity all this time, but how it's important to know when to get simple as well. So my simple question to you both is, if you could have this group take away one thing from the conversation today, what would it be?
You're gonna go first or me?
I'll go, and then you can pile on. I guess what I would say is the two things about the leaders I talked to, those 38 people. They had those 5 traits, etc. There are 2 things about them that I really like. I didn't sort of cover this in the book, but like I have a lasting thought about them. One is they're deeply intentional about the kind of leader they are. And that's a word people sort of like throw around casually, etc. But they're extremely intentional. They're not the kind of leader they are by chance. when generosity mindset flew out of Roseanne Haggerty's mouth, it's because she's thought about it a lot. So I think number one, I'd say is as you guys at your age, your thinking is going to evolve, et cetera, but be intentional, have an approach. The second one that sort of goes along with that is many of these people also had, like John's 3 C's, even though they didn't know their 3 C's. A lot of these people had a sense of principle, I would say even sometimes spirituality, faith that drove them. Maybe that's your care thing. I just, like, I didn't write about that in the book, but like, as I sort of reflected on it in the months after it, and I've talked about it in these kinds of conversations, I reflect on how intentional they were and how much they were guided by a set of principles, or sometimes a spirituality or philosophy, or sometimes even a faith that was really clear to them and that guided them sort of like through all the mess and the craziness. How about you, John?
Yeah. I think you have to be willing to grapple with the sort of fundamental uncertainty of all of the stuff that we do, and at the same time be fully engaged with the data and that's coming back to you, the reality around you, right? And I think that's true no matter what you're doing,
Good.
Love it.
We good, Jesse?
Yeah, thank you both so much. This has been an incredibly engaging conversation. I'm going to pass the mic to Cameron to wrap us up.
Awesome. Thank you, Jesse. And thank you, Paul and John. Sorry, I'm trying to navigate the chat here. I'm sending something in there, the chat, and so then my screen all moved. But regarding the recording, we will be sharing that in a follow-up email. And we also will be asking for some insight from all of you, because we'd love to hear what topics you want to hear next, as we are really aiming to do a series on this. And we also have tomorrow, we're starting a new thing called Social Impact Final Fridays. So we'd love for you to join us tomorrow and just kind of debrief the conversation. And we want to just gain your insights into what topics really resonated with you and what you'd hope to hear in future conversations. So thank you again, Paul and John, for the great discussion, and Jesse for a great moderation, and then our wonderful team who put this series on. So without further ado, I'll draw it to a close. Definitely check out the book. We'll have a link in the follow-up email to purchase that. But thank you all for being here. The great conversation in the chat, as well as just the thoughtful conversation between Paul and John.
Thank you, everyone, too. That was awesome.
Thanks, guys.
Have a good one. Bye-bye.